This tape is being made especially for Mrs. Jill Holloway of Charlton Kings, Cheltenham, Gloucestershire, in answer to a letter from her requesting the recollection of some of my experiences as a Bevlin boy. And Jill Holloway has again asked that, if possible, that I should use some of the North Staffordshire dialect. Well, this may be somewhat difficult after 50 years very nearly of non-practice, and I'm afraid that when I recall the stories, the dialogue that passed between the miners and myself, if I do not use the obscenities, the bad language that was in those circumstances part of every working day, the emphasis, the stories themselves, and certainly my recollection of those stories, will prove very weak if I do not tell the stories exactly as they occurred. And so if you're offended by any of the rude language, you have the choice of either turning the set off or throwing the cassette away, or accepting it for what it is. Now, the first intimation I had that there were such things as Bevlin Boys, or that it was anticipated that there might be, was on the 21st of August 1943, when I got a letter from the Ministry of Labour, a gentleman called L.A. Scantlebury, Regional Controller from Great Titchfield Street, London, saying that vacancies exist for workers in certain kinds of underground mining, and in view of the national importance of such work and the urgent need to provide the mines with an adequate supply of suitable labour, it has been decided that men who were required to register under the above acts may, if they so desire, be considered for transfer to underground work in the mines as an alternative to being called up for service in His Majesty's forces. Well, at that time I was signed on to go in the Royal Marines, and I was not at all in this alternative. And it did say, the last paragraph in that letter, please return this letter within 4 days from the above date. Well, I still have the reply slip, which of course was never used, and as a result of my apparent ill manners on that occasion by not replying to my correspondence, on Christmas Eve of that same year, 1943, it said that not nearly enough men are choosing this alternative to satisfy the government, and that men would be decided by ballot, strictly impartially of course, and your name is amongst those selected. Well, this of course in point of fact is the only ballot, the only lottery, the only raffle I've ever won in my life, and as a result of this, further directions told me that unless I reported as instructed, I could be liable on summary conviction to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 3 months, or to a fine not exceeding £100, or to both such imprisonment and such fine. Well, obviously I didn't want to go to prison, and so there was really very little alternative, and I followed the directions that were sent to me with all due apprehension, I might add, and was instructed to go to report to Euston to get the train, I think at about 11 o'clock on a January day, and to report to Stoke-on-Trent. My knowledge of Stoke-on-Trent was extremely limited. I knew that there were such things as the potteries, and I had heard the names of 2 gentlemen, Josiah Wedgwood and Stanley Matthews, and I did know which of those 2 played football. But apart from that, I had little to offer, and we arrived at Stoke on a very wet January evening, where an official met us with a coach to take us round to various landladies who presumably had not been decided by ballot, and who might reasonably be expected to be having remuneration for putting us up. Well, now, the digs which had been allocated to me, when I got there, for some reason that I never knew, these were no longer available. It wasn't the fact that the landlady ever saw me, so she didn't take an instant dislike to me. It was just that circumstances, I presume, had changed, and she had no room for me. So I remained on the coach until we came to the last port of call, which was in Leek Road, Shelton. Now, this lady had agreed to take 7 conscientious objectors and 1 Bevlin boy, and she did, after a little pressure was exerted, agree to take me. Although she hadn't room for me, she had got a night worker, and so therefore I could use his bed, leaving it warm for him on his turn when he got back from work in the morning, and when I went off to the training colliery at Kemble Pit. And so that was the arrangement for the first month. I can remember not too much about the training, in all honesty, except that a gentleman named Joe Ansell, who was a dear man, but quite one of the ugliest men I'd ever seen, and I thought, well, if this is a sample of all miners, it's going to be a frightening experience. But he really was a very dear and kind man, and I seem to remember that for the first month we went either down the Kemble Pit or we went to the training college, the technical college at Tunstall in Stoke-on-Trent. I remember not too much about that, because we were all Bevlin Boys or conscientious objectors. Certainly the Bevlin Boys, I think, were fed up with being there, and the conscientious objectors accepted it perhaps as an alternative. But there was nothing really very exciting to report, and after all we met very few miners, and these were the real people. After a month I changed my digs, because I felt it would be rather nice to have a bed which I could call my own and not be sharing with another chap. I expect he felt the same way. And I'd heard of some excellent digs in 202 Waterloo Road, Burslem, by another Bevlin boy who had been staying there and who was going back to his hometown of Birmingham in a pit fairly locally there. And here there was a splendid lady named Miss Lucy Ray, who was the landlady, and I took to her instantly. And I went there, it must have been in February 1944, and I stayed with her all the time I was in the potteries. And what is more, in fact, I kept touch with her after I'd left the potteries, and she subsequently moved to the East End of London. And we did exchange Christmas cards for over 40 years, and I fear dreadfully, although I visited her in London, that she must have passed on. But I was very fond of Lucy, and I ran her a ragged life. I mean, I'm ashamed in recalling the things I did and the advantages I took. And I remember that the digs were 30 shillings a week, and she put them up to 35. And I said, well, really, Lucy, this is quite impossible. I can't pay this exorbitant rate for full board for 35 shillings a week. I shall just have to look somewhere else. And I knew that the relationship between us was such that Lucy might possibly think again, and she drew me aside in the kitchen and she said, if you don't say anything to anybody else, you can stay here for 30 shillings. I pointed out all the useful things that I did in contributing to the happiness of the house. Frankly, I can't recall doing anything worthwhile, but Lucy accepted it, and I'm eternally grateful to her. So I went off then to start at Norton Colliery, which is at the bottom of Smallthorne in the potteries. And I used to go by bus from Cobridge, where my digs were, to Burslem, change buses, and then go on the bus to Norton Colliery. Again, I can't remember too vividly about working on the surface. It was all fairly drab. I can remember working on the, I think they called it a sort of pans or conveyor belt or something on the surface, where I'm not sure quite what our duties were, but we came in contact with coal in trucks and so on, and there were other things in the trucks which were not coal. And I found that fairly distasteful. I mean, that was excretia, which came up from down below. I found that fairly distasteful. But there we are. I can't recall anything terribly exciting about it. But then it came the turn, of course, after a month on the surface, it became necessary part of the whole process to go and work underground. And this, of course, filled one with trepidation and horror, really, the thought of getting in that pit, in that cage, and going down at what seemed like a rate of knots into the bowels of the earth. In point of fact, I don't think it was terribly far. It was something between a quarter and half a mile. And people talked about the big one, the deep at Hanley. And I thought, well, thank God I'm at Norton, because if Hanley's deeper than this will do for me. Anyway, about the only thing I could bring to this situation I was in, though I didn't realize it had any significance, was a certain ability for playing cricket. I'd never done any work in my life. My father was a parson. I'd come straight from public school, from boarding school, and seemed totally ill-equipped for the life that I was about to encounter. Now, the cricketing ability to which I refer, and which obviously had been passed on to the colliery manager by somebody other than myself, seemed to have some significance and some importance if I played for the Norton Colliery team in the North Staffordshire League. And the manager of the pit, Mr. Ernest Steele, suggested that I might go on the surveying staff and play cricket for Norton Colliery. I don't know whether it was an agreement, but it seemed a very reasonable proposition to me, though again I had absolutely no qualification to go on any surveying staff at all. Anyway, I was given a rather splendid tape measure in a leather case that one rolled up and pulled out, and a ball of string and a lump of chalk. And it was explained to me that one of my duties, in fact I think probably my only duty, was to measure where the supports would be on the coal face. And obviously I had instruction in this, and it wasn't too difficult to work out what one had to do. So I soon caught on to this, and I got a rather splendid pair of overalls, and I strutted about the place with this enormous equipment, string, chalk, and a measure, tape measure, flicking these chalk lines with forefinger and thumb onto the roof to denote where the timbers, where the structures, the steel supports had to go. Well, this all seemed rather splendid, and the miners themselves, who were sweating profusely while they threw the coal onto the conveyor belt from their shovels, viewed me not only with some suspicion, but I think almost hatred, that I could strut about here doing really precisely nothing. And to make matters worse, I used to say, well, now, come on, chaps, bollock it on. Bollock was a word that I had previously heard, and it was a word that was commonly used in everyday language in the pit. Well, life went on splendidly for a few weeks, except that I did from time to time have a slight tinge of conscience that I wasn't really making any great effort to the national wartime effort. But I counted my good fortune, I suppose. But anyway, one day the whole matter was taken out of my hands. I asked a colleague, a pal down there at the time, and he told me the time incorrectly. And I was never one for going to be leaving the pit late, and I made my way to pit bottom and passed Mr. Ernest Steele, the colliery manager, who said, where the bloody olders think they'd go in. And I said, another shift finished, Mr. Steele, one more day nearer de mob, in my usual jocular fashion, and thought no more of it, until I got to the pit the next morning, and there was a note on my lamp, on my battery, in the lamp house, and it said, since you've seen fit to disregard the confidence and trust I put in you, you will start loading on the coxhead seam as from this morning. Well, the message was quite clear to me. It meant I'd got to do some work. And I do recall thinking, well, at least I shall be doing something worthwhile, though I couldn't for the life of me think I was going to cope with it. Now, it had never occurred to me that one had to buy one's own pick and shovel. And I went along to the stores, and the chaps there had seen me around from time to time, and they said, what's they want then? And I said, well, I've come to get a pick and a shovel. What bloody getting it for? I said, for me, doing my best with the North Staffordshire dialect. What are they going to do with pick and shovel? I said, well, I've got to use it. They said, well, what sort of weight shovel do you want? Well, I didn't know there were weighted shovels. I know there are different weights of cricket bats. That's about the only thing I didn't know. But anyway, then I eventually got this pick and shovel, and I made my way to the cage. And some people who knew me very well said, where are they going then? Who are they carrying that for? And I said, well, I'm going to start loading on the coxhead seam. Anyway, I got down to the coal face and took my jacket off and rolled it up and put it neatly on a pile of coal and stripped to the waist or something. And then one of the miners down there said they'd catch bloody pneumonia, they would. They once put their bloody shirt on, matey. That me used to this sort of life. Anyway, there we were, and I was detailed to work under the guidance of a man named Joe Jones, who was known in the North Staffordshire coal mining industry as Big Joe. Big because he was big. He was a big man with a very big heart. And I was put to work with Joe. Now, Joe could not have been kinder. He was kindness itself, and he was, frankly, rather more interested in hearing how I, the son of a parson from the south of England, came to be down Norton Colliery than he was in how much work I did. So little work, I suppose, did I do, and so interested was Joe, that I was very quickly, I think within a week, if I remember rightly, moved on to work with another chap called Albie Hingley under his gun. Well, Albie was as little as Joe was big, but he too was a splendid fellow. And just in passing, these two particular men, of all of the men, I remained in close contact with until they died. Now, I had tremendous fun with both of them. They invited me to their homes. They invited me out at the weekends to have beer with them and play cribbage with them and so on. They were absolutely marvellous. And I suppose if I sat down and thought about it, could talk about Big Joe right through a couple of these tapes. So dearly did I love him. But we had such tremendous fun because he was interested in the fact that I spoke rather differently. And I went down the pit one morning, and it was a winter's morning, and I said, "It's frightfully cold this morning, Joe." He said, "Hey, Surrey, what did you see?" I said, "It's frightfully cold this morning." He said, He said, "I'll have to bloody practice that." So he practiced saying it's frightfully cold this morning for some days, until he really, in all honesty, had got it off pretty well. And one morning he came down and he said to the chaps, "It's frightfully cold this morning, fellas." And the only word that greeted him in reply to all his efforts at practicing this was bollocks. So Big Joe didn't practice any southern dialect anymore and stuck to his dear old North Staffordshire dialect. I remember too that very early in my loading days with a pick and shovel on the coalface, very early, in fact I think probably the first morning, I thought I'll really show these chaps that I can do a day's work. And I shifted what I thought was a mountain of coal. We started the shift at 7 o'clock, we had snapping at 11, started again at 11:20 and finished the shift at 2:30. But then of course there was time in which you had to use for travelling to the working place and time for leaving the working place. So the day wasn't just strictly 7 hours and a half. But I only mention this because this day I thought I'll make an impression, and I started shifting this coal, and I had worked myself up into a right lather, and I'd moved, I reckon, half the North Staffordshire coalfield, and was absolutely knackered. And I said to Joe, "Is it snapping time?" He said, "Bloody hell, sir, it's only 9:15. And I'd really had it for the day already. There were other splendid chaps down there. There was Jack Dawson, another tall man, and I remember particularly one day he came down. It was a Monday morning. Monday was always one of the most unpleasant days because the miners would empty their bowels of their weekend's drinking all over the coalface. Well, not all over the coalface, but on shovels, and then throw it onto the conveyor belts. And the aroma, if not to use too strong a word, stench, the aroma on the coalface on a Monday morning was something different. And Jack Dawson came down this Monday morning, and I said, "Did you have a good weekend, Jack?" And he said, "No, I didn't." So I said, "What's up with they?" He said, "I bigged her." Now this is a phrase I hadn't heard, and I'd bigged her, and what he in fact meant was he'd made his girlfriend Audrey pregnant. But bigged her was a word that had not yet come into my dictionary of North Staffordshire phrases. Freddie Mould, who I'm still in touch with, I can remember well Clive Owen, who was an absolute rogue, and I remember a chap particularly with the name of Pud. That was his nickname, and I, for reasons which you'll find perfectly obvious, don't intend to give you his surname. But he did really have he was the best endowed, now I better put it like that rather than the biggest anything, he was one of the best endowed chaps I've seen. And when I said to Big Joe, "By golly, old Pud's got a big un," he said him and his father and his brother had got a yard between them. Well now, of course, I never had any personal, not knowledge, but viewing, I suppose, of this fantastic feat. But if Big Joe said they'd got a yard, I reckon they probably had got a yard. Anyway, snapping was always an interesting time, and of course because I came from London and because I was from a parsonage or a vicarage, they used to sit around and say, of course, they bloody conservative they had. And it was all tremendous fun, and such was the rapport that whatever I said, I'd say, well, it's perfectly obvious that, that if anybody came down here now and saw the 7 of us sitting round, they'd know that you 6 were Labour and I was Conservative. It was a pretty stupid remark, but I mean, I could get away with murder. Such was their friendship, such was the relationship between us all. Now, once I ran out of suitable clothing to go down the mines. I mean, after all, you can obviously realise that anything will do. And I'd gone home for one Christmas, and I went to my mother's jumble sale. She had a jumble sale regularly every week in St Luke's Victoria Docks in the East End of London. And she held up an evening suit, a dinner suit, for which she was asking sixpence. Well, surprisingly enough, there was not a tremendous demand for dinner suits in the East End of London in the middle of the war. People in the East End of London were not celebrating too much, they were dodging bombs. So I bought this dinner suit because I thought this would go down a bomb at Norton Colliery. Anyway, I wrapped all this up in brown paper and I took it to the lamp house one morning. And I put it all on, and it was still dark. It was about 6:30 when I left the lamp house and left the bath, and went up to the lamp house. And of course, people uttered disbelief in the lamp house when they saw me in full evening dress, and I'd thrown a white shirt and even bought a bow tie, I think, for sixpence from Woolworths, just to finish the outfit off. And there I was with this dinner suit, a brown belt, clogs. I was wearing clogs, I remember, because they were cheaper than boots. Clogs, and of course the inevitable helmet, carrying a pick. And when I got to the top of the cage and came into the light around the cage head, the chap on the cage, who I think was named, I was going to say Sammy Gethin, but it wasn't. Doesn't matter what his name was. He looked at me and he said, "Where the fucking hell does think they going?" So I said, "I've just been to a party and haven't had time to change." And I was getting in the cage when I still heard him shouting out, "Fuck me. That bloody fucking fella from the bloody fucking south. What is he going to do next?" Anyway, down I went onto the coal face. And of course, folded up this evening jacket, this white shirt and bow tie, and put it all very neatly on a pile of coal, much to everybody's amusement and delight. And of course the story stayed with me almost through my entire time in North Staffordshire, and I was introduced years after by Big Joe to people I'd never met, and Joe would say, "Here, this is the youth I told thee about. This bugger wore a bloody dinner suit down pit." Another time I went home for a week's leave, and I was having some back trouble at the time, probably because of the draft on the coal face. There was this tremendous draft of cold air, and I imagine that with a sweaty back and cold air playing on it, it wasn't too difficult to get back trouble. I mean, I wasn't certainly not alone with having back trouble. And I went home and this back was playing me up, and the doctor said, "Well, you must have another week to get it right." So when I went back, Big Joe said, "Where's fucking been? Where's they fucking been? They went home for a week. They's been bloody fortnight. Where's been?" And I said I was bad, Joe. He said they'd always bloody bad that. They'd like Port Vale. They're bad. So he said, "What had been living on? What's used for money?" So I said, "Well, I went to the back of my father's church and there was a box there and it said, 'For the sick.'" "Fucking hell," said Joe. "What sort of a fucking Christian are they? Bloody man," he said. Anyway, this was the sort of repartee, the sort of fun that we had. And George Meredith, when I came to be leaving the pit, made another unforgettable remark, because he said, "What are you going to do when he goes warm? What are you going to do when you go home?" And I said, "Well, I thought I'd go in for the church." He said, "There's more money in mining than there is in vicaring." I said, "You don't look at it like that, George." I said, "You're called to the life." He said, "Oh, well, they bloody code." He said, "But 'twas never a vicar." And remarks like this stayed with me always, and I loved their sense of humour. I loved the time when they took a photograph of me underneath an RSJ, which I couldn't have even shifted from the ground. They had two miners either end holding the thing, not in shot, and me in the middle, looking like a sort of Tarzan or something. A picture which I treasured until somebody whipped it. Anyway, I got used to all these things, and I spent the time at the weekends with them, going to the dogs, to the greyhounds, playing cribbage with them, boozing with them, meeting their families, playing with their children, going to weddings, christenings, and becoming an absolute full part of all their activities. I got used to chewing baccy down the pit, I think it was £1 for a twist of baccy in the pithead in the pithead canteen. I remember all their hospitality. I remember their kindnesses. I remember occasions. I remember an occasion when I was in a pub. It was called the Swan one evening with dear old Joe, God rest his soul. And I was with Joe, and he said, was telling me some yarn, and I said, did you go and see Port Vale on Saturday? And he said, no, they don't come and say me when I'm bud. He said, I don't go and say them. And his wife came into the pub, and of course I immediately stood up and went over and greeted her and offered her a drink. And Joe called out to me, hey, Surrey, what are they bloody doing? I was talking today. Hasn't they got any bloody manners? Youth, hasn't they? Well, of course, I thought I was being well-mannered in standing up, but in Joe's book, he would have ignored his wife and gone on talking to me. I suppose I should just say that when I'm thinking about Joe, and I think about him constantly, even now, there was the time, of course, inevitably, when working down on the coal face, I wanted to empty my bowels. And I really didn't want to do what they were all doing. And I knew there was a bucket at pit bottom. And I decided that the time had come when I'd got to go. Now, it meant travelling about a mile, but I reckon it was preferable to travelling a mile, either crawling or walking or anything, to drop in my trousers and going on my shovel. Anyway, I was just about to go off, and Joe said, where are they going? I said, I'm going to pit bottom. I said, I want to be excused. And I did use that word deliberately, because it was a word that my mother used when describing that particular motion, rather discreetly. Do you want to sit down, Geoffrey? So I said to Joe, no, I want to be excused. He said, what a bloody on about? I said, I want to go to the toilet. He said, does one want to piss or shit? I said, I want to sit down. He said, well, bloody go here. I said, where? He said, on the bloody shovel. I said, I can't go here on the shovel. He said, of course they bloody. He says that, they're going bloody pit bottom, walking bloody mile and a half, just to have a bloody shit. Bloody go here. I said, I don't think I've got any paper. He said, there's some bloody wood shavings, use those. He said, you want to get any splinters in your arse? Well, you know, I still remember this, nearly 50 years ago. I mean, it made a pretty deep impression on my mind, if not on my backside. But of course, out of it all, I remember the good things. I remember the humour. I remember the friendship. If I really think I can remember the heat, I can remember the stinking dust, I can remember packing, that's the side where the coal has been drawn from. I can remember somebody coming back from the war, having gone all through the war, and I can remember him being killed in the pit within a week when the roof came in, and I can remember us all going out. I was told we were all going out because one always did if there was a death in the pit. I think any excuse, one would go out of the pit, whatever reason, half a reason you'd be out, because it was such a grim life. The chewing the bacca became part of my life. Once there was really no substitute for baccy. I mean, chewing gum was no good. You needed something to keep the saliva moist. Of course, as eventually it became nearer and nearer the day of my discharge, dear old Joe, Al being me, Freddie Mould, they all tried to persuade me not to come to work. They said, you've been down here 3.5, nearly 4 years, and apart from a few cuts on your hands and a few on your back, to give you a few good old miner's marks, you've come through this experience unscathed physically. Don't go and risk. Don't take any risks on these last few days. And I said, no, I'm going to go home with a full wage packet. I'm going to get my 5 shifts in. I'm going home with a full wage packet. And when it actually came to the last week, they would not have me on the coalface. They made me work on the roadways, as we called them. That's a lovely job. I did a bit of that. That's where you stand at the end of a conveyor belt, and all the coal and all the excretia comes off, and you make sure that the particular trolley, the particular wagon, is full before pushing another wagon underneath. Very easy to break fingers and get fingers caught doing that job. But anyway, I did that for the last week and saw these familiar objects probably for the last time. And I can't remember whether it was my last day. I presume it probably was, but I went up to the pithead canteen for my usual cup of char before I went home. and a lot of my pals, even more than usual, seemed to be there. And they presented me with a smoking cabinet for putting tobacco and pipes in. And I remember Albie Hingley made the presentation, and I've got it on display in my drawing room, in my lounge at home today, now, while I'm speaking. It's there always for everybody to see, because there is a small brass plate on which these words are written: to Jeff from his mates at Norton Colliery. Now that's very simple, but it says it all. If they'd have put colleagues or anything so flamboyant, it would have been wrong. But mates was the right word. And really, when you think about it, it's not a word you would ever put on an inscription, a plaque, on any presentation to anybody. You'd never put mates. You might put from colleagues, fellow workers, or something, but never mates. So that's why, in this context, mates was right, and mates is special. Now, of course, there were one or two lovely things which happened to me, nothing whatsoever to do with the pit. I mean, a fellow named Billy Briscoe, who was as well known in Stoke-on-Trent as Stanley Matthews, and also a footballer, was captaining an opposing side at a cricket match at what I would call in North Staffordshire dialect Sneyd Green, and he invited me home to supper, and I immediately fell for his daughter, Marjorie. And that, of course, would never, ever, that good fortune, the best good fortune ever in my life, to have met this girl, and subsequently married her, and just recently celebrated our ruby wedding. None of that could have come about but for that, winning that ballot from the Ministry of Labour in 1943. So I came WOM, as they said, in, I think, probably about August, September 1947. I can't be too sure. But those chaps taught me, as they would say, taught me what friendship really means. Now, even within the last 3 years, I've had a present of a Beswick horse and other miniatures of miners with wagons when I visited the potteries, because I never ever visit the potteries without seeing any of my old mining friends if they're still alive. Now, quite recently, I had the very good fortune to meet a chap I knew all those years ago named Cyril Dodd. And when I heard that he was working in the Bevlin Club, I was so excited at the thought I'd see him again. And I got there about this particular evening, and I said, "Is Cyril Dodd in?" They said, he's downstairs. He's playing snooker." So I went downstairs, and he wasn't in fact playing snooker, and I met him face to face, and I would have recognised him even if somebody hadn't told me his name. I would have known him immediately in the street. And I said, "Cyril." He said, "Hey, Surrey?" He said, "It's Joffers." Now, Joffers was a name that I was called by Big Joe. He christened me Joffers, and in fact I've called my house in Deal, Kent, Joffers, in his memory. And I said, because I can drop into R immediately when I see a miner. I said, "Bloody hell, Cyril, I'm the same day for about 40 bloody years, youth." And he said, "No." I said, "By Christ, we got some stuff to talk over." He says, "I've got to talk to thee now." He says, "I'm flogging raffle tickets." I couldn't believe it, that after 40-odd years, immediately on seeing Cyril, there was nothing more important that Cyril had to do on a Tuesday night at the Bevlin Club than sell raffle tickets. It wasn't in any way meant to be disrespectful, unkind, or anything. It was just that every Tuesday night Cyril sold raffle tickets at the Bevlin Club. And anyway, I said, "Well, I must see you, Cyril." So I went and made an appointment to see him the following evening, and he allowed me 45 minutes before he had to watch a snooker match, because he always watches a snooker match on Wednesday evening. Now, eventually, of course, Big Joe's health, which had been bad for some years, got the better of him, and I knew that he was dying, and I went to see him, as I always did when I visited the potteries. And he was sitting in front of a television set with his cap on, and he would be 72, I suppose, probably at the time, something like that. With his packet of Park Drive, he was still dragging away at the Park Drive and still coughing up years of pit muck. And his dear wife Elsie was there, who was an angel, looked after him, and I'm still in touch with her. And this was the last time I ever saw Joe alive, and he gave me a figure of a miner from his mantelpiece. And Elsie said, "You can't give that away, Joe. Somebody gave you that or something." And Joe said, "I can give anything to Joffers." And he turned to me
and he said, "I've always thought a lot about thee, thou knowst, Juffers. I've always thought a lot about thee." And it was said in such a way that there was never anything more sincere said than that. And that was Joe's full expression of love. Eventually, of course, I went to Joe's funeral. And, of course, Joe would have laughed his head off at that, because his wife Elsie had selected a grave next to her mother. And the grave had not been dug for some reason. And Joe was put down another grave and had to be brought up again and put down the next day in the right grave when it had been dug. And I could hear old Joe saying they bloody boogered it up to last. Made a bloody ash of it right at bloody end. I could still see that Joe would find that humorous. Of course I could talk at much greater length, but I hope that this 45 minutes on this tape will have conveyed to you, or anybody who's listening to it, my eternal gratitude to the miners in the North Staffordshire coalfield, to the people of North Staffordshire, who are so warm in their friendship, and for whom I have the highest regard, the highest esteem, and who I shall continue to visit until I am again with Big Joe.